So it's a pleasure to introduce Ken McHardy. He comes to us from Aberdeen. He's been a diabetologist, clinical endocrinologist at the University of Aberdeen, and he has been a major person in identifying Macleod's early origins and his role in Scotland, and we'll trace that whole expedition right now. So his title is The Impact, How Michael Bliss Gave Macleod Back to Aberdeen.
I can't really overestimate what a privilege it is for me to be here today as a guest of the Toronto Medical Historical Club and to have this fabulous opportunity to honour three heroes. The dramatis personae for my short play are John James Rickard Macleod, Michael Bliss, and Michael Williams. Let's fill in a little bit about each of them. Macleod, 1876 to 1935, Scottish physiologist. He attended Aberdeen Grammar School, that's my old school, 84 to 93, and graduated in medicine in 1898 from the University of Aberdeen. His main output relating to my story is, of course, participating in the production of the first useful insulin in 1921-22, and going on to win the Nobel Prize, which he shared with Frederick Banting for that discovery. Next hero, Michael Bliss, a historian who did extremely well despite the fact that he was not educated at Aberdeen Grammar School and did not attend Aberdeen University. As John Dirks has just told us, his bestseller, The Discovery of Insulin in 1982, was a major part of our understanding of the story, and Michael went on to champion Macleod's cause for 35 years after this book was published. Michael Williams will be less well known to you. He was born in 1931 and still lives in Aberdeen. He was a consultant in diabetes. He did have the benefit of an Aberdeen Grammar School and Aberdeen University education. And in 1993, with Michael Bliss's support, published a biography of Macleod. But he features in my story as a naive Aberdeen diabetes specialist, because this tale is all about how in Aberdeen we too forgot about Macleod. So the modern way is to declare interests, and having spent my career working in a government-funded public health service, I don't have much to say about this. So I think that the declaration of interests will be my overlap with some of the things going that may lead anyone to believe I could be biased in my presentation. Aberdeen, Aberdeen Grammar School, the University of Aberdeen, and I'm a retired physician at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. So let's just do these in turn. Aberdeen, Scotland, for those of you who don't know it, 57 degrees north of the equator. This is the climate, temperate. It says we get sunshine all the time. I can't remember that quite so much, but it's not too cold and it's not too warm, and it's actually very like Toronto this time of year. The traditional industries in which we were built, it occurred to me when I put these slides together, would do rather well for rock, paper, scissors. A big granite industry with much of the city built of the silver stone. A big paper industry in its time, and even scissors cutting Crombie cloth. And I suppose there are even people in Toronto who know about Crombie coats. There's always been a big maritime history with a busy port, and fishing was big in its time too, but it's rather faded now. This is what Aberdeen looked like just the other week. And of course, we've been the oil capital of Europe for a number of years. That too is on the wane and being replaced by renewable energy. We, like many other places, have got windmills off the beach. Second interest, Aberdeen Grammar School. This is what it looked like in Macleod's time. It had been rebuilt on that site in 1863, but the school dates back to the 13th century. And here is the first picture I have of Macleod with the red halo around his head. aged about 9 in the class at Aberdeen Grammar School. 84 to 93 is when Macleod attended, and that was roughly in between Lord Byron, who was the statue now stands in front of the school. He was the only one to be in colour, and this other black and white fellow who attended the school between 64 and 73, and once looked much younger than he does now. The University of Aberdeen was established in 1495, third in Scotland, fifth in Britain, and the original college at King's was later supplemented in late 16th century by Marischal College, which is the second largest granite building in the world, somebody tells me. And both of these establishments amalgamated in 1860 and carry on as the University of Aberdeen. And it's through that arch on the right that I went to start my classes, including working in the department where Macleod would later work and had earlier studied. The Royal Infirmary building dates from mid-18th century, ancient, but by this time, when Macleod was doing his clinical studies, these pavilions were built on the site, and that was completed around about 1900 in the city centre. And that red ring round there shows the place where I practiced clinical diabetes in the outpatient department. That building did the diabetic clinic from 63 to 2013, and more of where we moved to later. The main hospital site moved west to a site that was far too far out in the country to ever be sensible. It is, of course, now completely encased within the city. And then this site, which was built serially over a number of years, starting in 1936, is where most of the inpatient medical practice takes place. But it wasn't in existence in Macleod's time. So, quick note on Macleod, co-discoverer of insulin, 4 portraits at the bottom with approximate dates on the column. After graduating from the medical school in Aberdeen, he was a trainee physiologist. He worked in Leipzig, came back to Aberdeen for a time, and then had 3 years in London. He did so well that he was invited to become Professor of Physiology at Western Reserve in Cleveland at the age of only 26. He set sail with his new bride a week or so before his 27th birthday and spent 15 years in Cleveland and developed a great interest in carbohydrate physiology. By 1913, he had produced a monograph, Diabetes, Its Pathological Physiology. He was headhunted by Robert Faulkner, who spent some time persuading him to come to Toronto, which subsequently Macleod said was the best move he'd made in his life. But then he said other things when he came back to Aberdeen about that was the best move he'd made as well. So, of course, at Toronto, he was involved in the discovery of the first clinically useful insulin and awarded the Nobel Prize. And then in 1928, he returned as Regius Professor of Physiology to University of Aberdeen, where he was a researcher, continued being an author, was the Dean of the Medical Faculty, and a mentor to many. Now, when Macleod died in 1935 at the age of 58, he was largely forgotten about at home and abroad. That was until Michael Bliss produced the definitive discovery of insulin in 1982. As we've heard, using original sources and developing new perspectives, promoted the idea of the team of 4 and certainly championed Macleod's cause. And his work was largely unchallenged for 35 years after he first wrote it. He also produced this biography of Banting, and if I could just be permitted a few notes on Michael Bliss and the Aberdeen groupie. I first heard Michael speak in the examination schools in Oxford at the British Diabetic Association in 1984. In 1988, he came to Aberdeen to speak at the Physiological Society meeting, and that presentation is recorded in the Quarterly Journal of Experimental Physiology. In 1996, I made my only previous visit to Toronto as part of the Eli Lilly UK group attending the American Diabetes Association. Instead of spending a couple of days at their HQ in Indianapolis, that year we came to Toronto because the 75th anniversary exhibitions were laid out, and spent a morning with Michael and then visited the Fisher Library. Later that year, Michael gave his second lecture in Aberdeen, and that was at the opening of Kevin Doherty's laboratory. Kevin Doherty was the professor, the Macleod Smith Chair of Biochemistry, and we know which Macleod endowed some of the money that built that. And it was during that visit that Michael Williams and I took Michael Bliss out and showed him some of our local scenery, and then returned with him to the Kildrummy Castle Hotel, which he and Elizabeth liked, and we took tea with them there. I'll show you a picture of that at the end. Not of the tea, of the Castle Hotel. In 2013, Michael came to Aberdeen for his third and final post-discovery of insulin lecture, and I'll tell you more about that later too. And the following week, he gave the Douglas Guthrie History of Medicine lecture at the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh. So he had certainly brought the insulin story to our attention and the people in it. But what of my third hero, Michael Williams? Michael Williams is now in a care home. He used to be my boss, and after 42 years, he thinks he's still my boss, and I get instructions from him fairly regularly, so he'll be phoning for a report on this very soon. So Michael Williams was born in 1931, recently celebrated his 91st birthday. He was born in Aberdeen to an Aberdeen family, but they'd never heard of Macleod. He attended Aberdeen Grammar School, Macleod's old school, from 1936 to 1945, but he'd never heard of Macleod. He went on to the local medical school, 1948 to 54, the medical school where Macleod had trained and where Macleod had later been the professor of physiology. But he'd never heard of Macleod. And then from 1954 to 1968, apart from 2 years out of Aberdeen in his doing national service, he worked in the hospital and/or university departments, practicing his trade and developing the skills to be a consultant general physician with an interest in diabetes. But he'd never heard of Macleod. From 1968 to 94, he worked for the local health board as a consultant diabetologist. And it was during this time, in 1982, that the big reveal came when he sent for a copy of this new book written by some Canadian about the discovery of insulin. And that, unbelievably, is when Michael Williams first heard the name J.J.R. Macleod. By 1988, on the Physiology Society visit, he met Michael Bliss and was given great encouragement towards producing this biography of Macleod, which he wrote by 1993. And I'm hoping to have this republished shortly, an updated version of the book. So, at last, we've remembered something about Macleod in Aberdeen. This is the gravestone that stood in Allenvale Cemetery since 1935. It's got the caduceus symbol on the top and says co-discoverer of insulin, but no one knew of it. And after Mike Williams started writing stories about Macleod, the council paid attention and put a plaque near the entrance of the house that he moved to when he returned to Aberdeen. We're doing rather better of late. Provost Skeen's house, big old house in the city, has recently been opened as a people's museum. And if you're quick, Macleod's Nobel Medal is on show here. I helped the history coordinators to put together a virtual exhibition, which they assure me is still online. So if you go to that website and type in something like insulin, then you can have 30 minutes more of me telling you about this. We've also put together a website this year, jjrmacleod.org, that will give you more details of his story. This is another thing I was called in from the long grass to do in November, was to present the first ever recipient of the Macleod Medal. This is awarded by Diabetes UK, patient self-help organisation, to those who have lived 70 years with diabetes. And this gentleman, Joseph Buchan, was our first local recipient who received the medal in November. And he told me that people don't realise what it was like in the old days He worked as a farm assistant when he first developed diabetes. And he said, we didn't have electricity for the first 5 years of my diabetes, so I was often taking my insulin by lamp or torchlight. There is even a society got up now that's trying to raise money to build a statue to Macleod in Aberdeen. That's their business card. And as part of the insulin trail, the virtual exhibition, we've put together the Aberdeen Insulin Trail, looking around various sites within the city, and I'll be happy to guide any of you around there when you visit Aberdeen, surely this summer. So what about Bliss Remembered? Back to November the 1st, 2013. Here is the Macleod plaque at the end of his drive, just at the west margins of the city of Aberdeen. On the right-hand side, Michael Williams, Macleod's biographer, standing next to Professor Neva Heites, the current owner of the house. And then Michael Bliss and myself on the other side of the plaque. And later that autumn afternoon, Michael gave his third and what was to be his final lecture in Aberdeen. And then, to complete the circle, performed the official opening of the new J.J.R. Macleod Centre for Diabetes, Endocrinology and Metabolism at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. And that's where we escaped from the ancient dungeons at Woolman Hill up to Forrester Hill in 2013. So Michael was delighted to attend and to perform that task for us en route for his lecture in Edinburgh. So with a picture of the promised hotel, that, ladies and gentlemen, is my short story of how Michael Bliss gave Macleod back to Aberdeen. Thank you.